Hello, hello. My name is Gabriel Fairman, and today I'm with Robert Mahari, our guest in Merging Minds. And we're very excited to have Robert today. Robert is pursuing a joint JD PhD degree at Harvard Law School and the MIT Media Lab. His work focuses on computational law, leveraging computation to analyze, improve, and extend the study and practice of law. He studies how technology can and should affect the practice of law with a focus on increasing access to justice and judicial efficacy. His work focuses on computational law, leveraging computation to analyze, improve, and extend the study and practice of law. And Robert, thank you so much for being here with us. I've seen a little bit of your brilliant work, and we're honored to have you. And anything that you'd like to add to this very brief description of your work and your, let's say, your overall project and mission?
Absolutely. Well, great to be here with you, Gabriel. And thank you for the introduction and the invitation. Just for the folks listening, I came to law school with a technical background. I had studied chemical engineering at MIT, and I got the sense that the practice of law was maybe a little bit antiquated. Like maybe there was some room to explore like technologies that could improve how we practice law, improve the access to legal services, things like that. And so I reached out to a professor, Sandy Pentland at MIT. He had founded, among other things, this publication called the Computational Law Report. This is kind of coalition of different law schools and legal experts coming together, thinking about the future of law. And we started collaborating and talking, and over some time, we were able to figure out that we could create a new joint degree between Harvard Law School and this place at MIT called the Media Lab, which is this super interesting interdisciplinary research laboratory here at MIT with people doing all sorts of different things. And so kind of halfway through law school, I started my PhD here. And really the goal of the PhD, especially at the beginning, was, how do we build technologies that support legal practitioners and people navigating legal services? This then also kind of evolved into like, what are the incentives? Like, why isn't the law kind of developing more technology? Like, what are the barriers? What are the issues? What are the risks? And then lately, as we've seen kind of the rise of generative AI, there's this other question, which is more about how do we take like the regulatory objectives, what we want to achieve with AI, prevent certain kinds of harms, prevent certain types of risk, all these kinds of things, and embed them into technologies. This is kind of like the example I like to give is, when we built elevators, the first person to develop the passenger elevator, it's called the Otis elevator by a man named Otis, and no one really wanted to get into it. And so what he did is he went to the World Fair, he got into his elevator, and he cut the rope. And he didn't fall to the ground because there were ratchets, and as soon as the tension was released, they clicked into place and they stopped the fall. That's what we want for AI, right? Like a fail-safe mechanism that's technically embedded. And so we're working kind of on thinking about new ways of developing AI technologies and AI systems as a whole to embed these kind of important goals and priorities. And so I call this regulation by design. And yeah, happy to talk about all of that. And great to be here.
There's a lot to unpack, but first, I want to understand that there's a lot of pioneering in your personal or academic journey, at least from what you're describing. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the most conventional path to go from chemical engineering to law with this big emphasis in developing this new approach to law. What was there any particular event in your life or anything that like you felt impelled you to go in this direction? Were you always a little bit kind of like an out of the box thinker? Like how do you think this journey kind of took place?
So the one thing I can tell you is that without knowing where I would end up, I think kind of early on the scene was set. Like now looking back, it's like I remember being kind of interested in law school and law really early on in undergrad. I cross-registered at Harvard Law School as a sophomore, took a class on corporate law, really liked it. Did some RAing with like a Harvard Law School professor, really enjoyed that. I think, in a way it's interesting because fundamentally I like technology. I like building technology. I like being able to like build a thing that affects people's lives. But all of that technology exists within like the legal fabric. And I think there's something very exciting about going between these two worlds, right? Like a technological system that affects people's lives, and then also the kind of social fabric within which that system occurs. And I don't know, it sounds a little philosophical, but there are some really interesting links, right, between law and technology. And it's like different skill sets. Like it hasn't been explored as much as it could, although you go back, like Oliver Wendell Holmes over 100 years ago said, the lawyer of the present might be the black letter lawyer, like the lawyer with books and textbooks and case law, but the lawyer of the future will be one of statistics and mathematics. So like this theme has been around. I just find it very exciting. I think it's like it's great to be in a space without that much, to go, like, where you can really kind of think about new problems, new data sets, new systems, and build them, and like do new things. So I'm very attracted to that, and I feel very lucky to be kind of at a time when that's possible in this kind of space.
So your interest in this more computational approach to law predates GPT-3, for instance. So it was almost, would you call it a coincidence, or do you think you could kind of see it coming, like, because you seem to be really well positioned for everything that's going on?
I think I got lucky with the timing. Absolutely. I remember early on in my PhD spending so much time labeling data. Like we were interested at one point in understanding what attorneys were making in class action lawsuits. And so for hundreds of cases, we labeled like the different dollar amounts in a class action opinion. And this is what the attorney got. These were the costs for paralegals, like all of these different costs, and training models to do this. And now you can just ask ChatGPT and it will give you like the correct, you can give it a judicial opinion and be like, how much did the attorney make? And in what people call zero shot learning, like it can just do it. And I don't think that, I definitely didn't foresee it. I don't know if it was foreseeable 5-6 years ago that we would have technology that can do it. But of course, this unlocks tremendous new potential. And it means that like a lot of the things that we've been doing for decades, right, in terms of like empirical legal research and things like that, we can do so much more, right? Because instead of having an army of RAs like label, commercial loan agreements or something, you just give them to ChatGPT, and for like maybe $20, like on the high end, it's like labeled them, it's extracted the data, it did all of the stuff that would have taken months, and now you can do much larger scale analyses. And like that's just using AI as like a tool to be able to do the work we've been doing for a long time. So I think there's going to be some really interesting new opportunities, both in legal academia and in legal practice. I think it's an exciting time.
I share the excitement, because I think what you're describing is a really clear cut win where you can do so much more with so much less, and it's not like, let's say, you're necessarily getting rid of jobs or getting rid of things, or adding an extra dimension of statistical analysis that was previously nearly impossible, or at least infeasible from an economic perspective, to put together large teams, for instance, working for months just labeling data. And now you could get through that potentially very, very fast and very inexpensively. And then that opens, another kind of virtuous cycle, which is what you can do with that data and what you can learn from them and so on. But just to kind of contextualize you a little bit in our field. So we're in the translation and localization field. So basically a field made up mainly of translators. And translators have been using technology for a while now. I would say, if you consider writing technology, they've been using it forever, but they've been using computers for translation, I would say, for more or less 40 years. And at first, it was always a more syntactical approach towards language. So basically storing previous translations, suggesting translations that were syntactically similar. And there was always a lot of pushback from translators saying, this is dehumanizing me or taking away from my creative translation process. And then machine translation has also been growing as a force in the past 20 years, I would say. It predates that, but it has been really becoming more adopted in the past 20 years. But for the most part, translators had a fairly easy time proving that they were so much less embarrassing, let's say, than a neural machine translation engine that could make very, very costly mistakes for enterprises. And the human value was always unquestioned, except for very small use cases and edge cases that people could produce. But now I'm sensing, based on what I hear from both translation buyers and translators, there's a much bigger sense of potential peril, doom over their trade as translators, because GPT does and other models as well, but GPT as an example does such a better job than any previous tech out there as far as being able to contextually sense tiny little things in language. But I realize that maybe you're not familiar with our industry, but without this familiarity at first glance, how do you see this disruption playing out?
So there's a couple kind of themes that I've observed, and I will ask you to help me kind of translate them for your audience a little bit. So the first one, which is the most general one, is we did a very large scale audit of AI training data, and we just looked into, especially for fine tuning data. So this is kind of, you've already learned how to do like the basic grammar and syntax, and now you're kind of tuning these models to be good at answering questions or, different kinds of specific tasks. And we were interested in what are the licenses, like where are these data sets coming from? What is the like global coverage, things like that. And everybody already knew, like if you project like the data set density onto the map of the globe, you have like Western Europe and the US and China, and then you have a little bit of coverage elsewhere. But what's interesting is when you start projecting where the data set creators are, so the people who are making those data sets, it is even more concentrated. So what this tells us is that there are people who are in the US who are producing data sets in other kinds of language. And the threat is, and this doesn't have to be true, right? The threat is that even though we have an Arabic data set or a Swahili data set or, some other language data set, the kind of cultural context and the nuance and the norms and all of that might not make it. I mean, the language can be correct, but like all of the kind of more subtle things are going to be missing. We also notice that the data sets for these kind of low resource languages tend to be licensed less permissive. So while English data sets tend to be very open, use them however you want, partially probably driven by the increased cost and labor required, people who publish data sets in kind of more low resource languages tend to use more restrictive licenses, as is their right. But the challenge is we don't know what GPT-4, for example, was trained on. And there is a possibility that if you are on the other end of this and you're thinking, well, what data sets do I want to use? I'm going to steer clear of the ones that say do not use these for commercial purposes, because I don't want to deal with these creators, mostly academics. Like it's hard to even get a hold of them, negotiate terms. There's a university involved. And so I think that, there's going to be room, even with these language models, for kind of more the human touch, right? Like I think there's going to be a very long period where, and maybe forever, where like models cannot replace the human in that way. And we see this in law all the time, right? Like a lawyer has certain duties about giving clients the correct advice, generating documents, drafting briefs. And I think technology will get better and better and better. But like a lawyer also has a role of telling someone who just lost everything in a fire or everything in a business dispute, this is going to be okay. I'm going to help you through this. This is what you need to be focusing on right now. My team can handle it this week. I'll call you on Friday, take some time. Like those are also important things. And I don't know. I don't think that like AI is going to learn to do that in a meaningful, deep way. The other piece of it that I've seen is like people are concerned that lawyers are going to lose their jobs in the same kind of way that I expect that some translators might be concerned. But, lawyers do a whole range of different tasks in a day. Chances are that only some of those tasks really lend themselves to automation, and other tasks, like these human touch tasks, but also other tasks that are just complicated, that require kind of more long range reasoning, those are harder to automate. So those will stay. And finally, like from a risk management perspective, like sometimes I see research where people are focused on automating judges. To me, like the last thing we will automate are judges. Talk about like a place where we can have massive negative societal consequences. So let's help people with legal research and drafting documents, and maybe even like optimal strategies for negotiating to settlements to get people to like move out of court and have better outcomes. All of those things seem like good ideas, but like don't start with the high risk stuff. Like think about the riskiness of what you're doing. And I think translation is going to be similar, where there are kind of low risk applications where using AI makes sense. By the way, in law, most civil legal disputes, like in the United States, they don't actually use a lawyer. Like regular people generally can't afford a lawyer. So they proceed without a lawyer, or they don't use the legal process at all. And so that is really the target market. I expect translation will be similar again. Lots of people who might benefit from translation, who currently like don't do it at all, or maybe they use like Google Translate, or they ask their kids to translate in the RMV, which we've all seen. But maybe like there's a room for like an AI agent to kind of help with that. And that's growing the pie. That's not taking anyone's job away, because those jobs don't exist right now because the economies of scale don't work out. So just some thoughts. I hope some of that's helpful.
No, that's super helpful, and I tend to agree with your perspective, because I think what resonates with me is you're describing first and foremost the technology fundamentally as a tool and not as, let's say, a competitor to humans. So, and I think that's a very basic paradigm distinction from someone who really is competing against the technology. And what I see, and I don't know if this resonates with you, but what I see a lot is, I don't know if it's because of the fear, but I see a lot of translators trying to prove themselves worthy and GPT, for instance, as unworthy. Kind of like similarly, like you see some of this going on with self driving cars, right? Maybe statistically, self driving cars are already safer than most human beings driving a car, but they have to be considered maybe 100 times safer for people to actually be willing to adopt them at scale or something like that. I don't know the exact number, but there's this bias towards competing against the technology rather than using it. And I have this sense that this bias or paradigm shift can be actually almost self-fulfilling, in the sense that if I don't adopt these tools like you're just, because in the use cases you're describing, you have people who are adopting these tools to expand their capabilities, to expand the scope of their work. But if I kind of just pretend this stuff isn't there, there's a pretty big chance I'm going to just become outdated. Or how do you react to this?
Yeah, I think two quick remarks, right? One, and people say this, I feel like, of every profession now. It's like it's not an AI that will take your job as a lawyer, it's a lawyer using AI that will take, right? So, presumably, like I totally agree. These are assistive technologies. I think there are larger like philosophical reasons why it's very dangerous to anthropomorphize these tools too much. But just from a purely like pragmatic like enterprise perspective, like these are assistive technologies. Maybe one day they will be more, but for like the time being, they are assistive. So use them, take advantage of them if it makes sense. I'm always surprised when I hear people who are very negative about AI, and then I ask them like, "Oh, have you like played around with it? Like maybe your use case just doesn't make sense." And they're like, "Oh no, I wouldn't touch it." It's like it's hard for me to understand why you wouldn't try, right? Like it's a little bit like why wouldn't you use word processing? Like try it, and maybe if you really only do phone calls, then it doesn't matter, and then move on. The second thing, and this is a little bit more subtle, is AI makes different kinds of mistakes than humans. And because of that, it sometimes seems very stupid. In the self-driving car example, I was recently at a talk at an MIT kind of computer science event, and someone was saying, there was an accident where the AI self-driving car system saw a white truck at the kind of horizon going across the road, and it interpreted the white truck as a cloud, and so it went full steam ahead and it crashed. So now, of course, like a human wouldn't make that mistake. Like we make, but on the other hand, like AIs don't get drunk. They don't get behind the wheel when they're tired. Like there's some mistakes that humans make that AIs don't make. I would think that the same is true I know the same is true in legal contexts, right? We had a very famous case last summer where an attorney used ChatGPT to draft a brief, and ChatGPT just kind of hallucinated all of the case citations. And then when the attorney was challenged by the court, like, hey, can you give us these cases? Like, no one can find these cases. ChatGPT actually wrote the cases, the opinions. And the lawyer kind of submitted those. And it was really kind of an unfortunate situation. But like a human wouldn't make that mistake. If like an associate at a law firm, the first week, she's asked, hey, can you draft this like memo? One, I don't think she would make up cases. And two, like by the time her boss comes back and says, hey, like I can't find any of these cases, the court wants to know where you got them from, I don't think she would sit down and write the cases out and give them back. Like these are the kinds of like reactions and mistakes that like humans just don't make. I'm sure there are similar situations in translation where there are mistakes that aren't made by humans that are made by AI. And so all that I'm trying to say is only because you see mistakes that appear very like obvious and stupid doesn't mean that the technology is like useless in general, right? So ask yourself, are these kinds of mistakes that I can catch easily, right? Are these mistakes that maybe I can design the technology in a slightly different way? Because now you're using an off-the-shelf general purpose technology to do something very specific, right? So maybe you need to do some tweaks. Maybe you need to think about the inputs and how you structure the whole system to get something that's actually useful for you. That kind of assists you in your job. So yeah, just some thoughts there.
Yeah, I love the angle. But you did mention something that I want to explore a little bit more. You mentioned some of the philosophical risks of anthropomorphizing the technology. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is really like we're moving away from my like research and more towards, I don't know, I think opinions I've come to, but whenever I teach about AI, or give talks about it, especially when we're talking about AI regulation, I like to ask people, like, think about the risk that scares you the most. And there's a whole range of them, right? So there's people who worry about misinformation. There are going to be AI chatbots that disrupt how we talk to other humans. There are people who think about job loss, right? That AI is going to take your job. There are people who think about human expression and creative industries and things like that. Then there's some of the more existential risks. AI is going to get loose and create bioweapons, or help people create bioweapons, or shut down power plants or ground planes, all these kinds of risks. And like, you can assign different kind of probabilities to these, and like probability of detection, probability of being able to do something about it all. What I think gets less attention, and I'm very scared of it personally, is like the addictive potential of having an agent that passes the Turing test. Like, for all intents and purposes, I'm sure your viewers, I remember, so I'm sure your viewers remember, like, I used to spend so many hours talking to my friends on MSN Messenger. No video, no nothing, just chatting back and forth. That was perfectly sufficient to like keep me entertained. I knew my friend was on the other side, and somehow that was like a good way to spend my time. We have tools now that are getting very close, and like, give it months or maybe a year or two, and they will be there, where you can have whatever friend you want, right? And that can also be whatever romantic partner you want. That can be whatever mentor you want, whatever you want on the other side of this, having a conversation with. And I worry about the addictive potential of that, right? Because we were never in a position, like, in all of human time, as far as I know, where like I think this is unprecedented, where you could have another person, agent, on the other side of a conversation that acts exactly the way you want them to, right? Where you have full control over how they react and what they like care about and what you talk about. And so I worry about, how will we interact with other human beings? How will we be spending our time? And also, and this is the piece that worries me here, is how do we like guard against this risk? Because I think it's a risk, but this is the kind of risk that people will invite in, right? Like, people will enjoy having these conversations, these friendships, all this kind of stuff. So it's not like the kind of risk where no one wants to be misinformed. People want, they disagree about what information is true, but like, no one wants to be misinformed. People do want these kinds of connections. So this is the risk that worries me. I mean, we've gone far beyond like translation and legal, but I think, yeah, of course there are like more mundane risks as well, like more enterprise risks. But
Yeah, I was thinking more. I mean, I agree with you. I see those risks, but I guess I was thinking more about the risk of misusing language to describe what the technology is and is not. So, for instance, the term hallucination, right?
yeah.
That's something that human beings do. Human beings hallucinate. You take a hallucinogenic drug, or you're having a hallucinogenic dream, and it's a human experience that
Mhm.
we're attributing to a machine.
Mhm.
And for me, I'm not necessarily a machine learning scientist, but to me, it's pretty clear that let's say, it's a fail of the transformer model. It's making some kinds of associations that aren't meant to be, or aren't correlating back to normal human logic, let's say.
Mhm.
But if we were to call it, instead of hallucination, maybe a decorrelation, or something that is more technical, my perception is that people would be less likely to put themselves in the position of competing with the tech. For instance, you mentioned the examples, right? The people get drunk behind the wheel. The technology does not. Same thing, right? I don't hallucinate. The technology hallucinates.
Mhm.
I think the more people compare themselves with the technology, and the more, and I notice that this is very prevalent. It's like, even people begin using these terms very loosely. It's like, as awareness, for instance. Again, very very human term, philosophically loaded. And I hear people, sometimes
Mhm.
including myself, describing a large language model as being aware of a certain context.
Mhm.
And I wonder, and maybe this isn't something that you give a lot of thought of, but I wonder how much you believe that the terms that we use to refer to the different aspects of the tech actually shape our relationship to it and the outcomes as well.
Look, I'm sure there's something to that, right? I'm sure that as people anthropomorphize, they maybe kind of ascribe human values and human agency in a way that just doesn't make sense. I think where we see this a lot is when people talk about ownership, right? Like, is AI capable of producing art, filing a patent, owning, property? And it's a little bit odd because we've never asked this about the camera, right? Even though, the camera fixes things from reality onto a thing. And quite honestly, people talk about explainability, and I think it makes sense to talk about, but like, I don't really understand how a camera works. And I challenge most users of cameras to really explain how the camera works. But like, even though it's kind of a black box and like, okay, it takes reality and it creates a digital file or a photograph, there's no question that it's like a tool that's being used for some human purpose. So yeah, I think, back to what I was saying earlier, the kind of tangent, sometimes it's just because of the way that these tools express themselves, which again is a shorthand for something else, but like the outputs that we get, they seem very human, they seem very human. And I think it's worth thinking about, okay, this is not a human. It has different kinds of limitations. It makes different kinds of mistakes. I think different people disagree about this. I personally think that sometimes language matters a lot, but other times we like weaponize language a little bit and we use it as a barrier to people out. And so, especially as someone who's interdisciplinary, I'm like hesitant to tell people, well, you should really call this like, machine unlearning or call this like, gradient, stochastic descent, and all these kinds of terms that like, yeah, maybe technically like we should be using them, but like it's fine to say that, high pressure areas want to be in low pressure areas. We know what we mean when we use these kinds of shorthands. So I think a more general kind of understanding of like what the technologies do and maybe what the technical possibilities are. So for example, in the what I talked about with the lawyer who used ChatGPT, ultimately like all large language models are doing, the only thing they're doing is they're predicting the next word given some words you've given. And it turns out this is powerful, right? It turns out that if we're really good at predicting the next word, we know about facts because we can say, oh, well, the capital of France is, and it's going to tell us Paris and not New York. It knows about grammar, right? Like it knows when a verb is supposed to come in a sentence. It knows about lots of different kinds of things, even about like physical occurrences, right? Like I dropped the ball and when it hit the ground, and it will know, oh, bounce because balls bounce. So like it seems like these models learn a lot about the world, and in a kind of sense they do, but they're not like knowledge retrieval engines. That's not what they're designed used for. And so if you want to do knowledge retrieval, there are better ways of doing that. And you can combine them with large language models to then do, knowledge retrieval and generation. Sometimes people call this retrieval augmented generation. So there are better ways of doing it. So rather than getting too hung up on the terminology, I think focus on educating yourself on like what the different technologies are and how you can utilize them in your specific context in a way that isn't risky, but that maybe unlocks new value and new potential.
No, I agree with you. I don't think it's a matter of being hung up on the terminology, but I do think that the terminology, for instance, what you're proposing to me makes perfect sense. You're suggesting basically learning and figuring out what these things really mean, right? But you just laid out, for instance, a very clear distinction between knowledge and prediction, right? Predicting something doesn't necessarily mean you know what it is. Knowledge from an epistemological sense, something much deeper, right? And harder to define. And there's a lot of debate on what knowledge is, what it's not, what wisdom is, what's not. Anyway, and I think, and I agree in the sense that instead of worrying so much about the terminology, it makes more sense to really try to get a grasp of what these things are. But what I see most people that I talk to, because there is a certain degree of complexity as to how a large language model works. I mean, it's not something trivial that I could necessarily explain. You throw around the terminology, oh, it's just a transformer model and you're vectorizing the word. I mean, using the words is one thing. Really understanding what those words are doing and how to build these models out, I mean, it's no wonder that it took us, so many years of computing and research to get there. It's something really technically sophisticated and advanced. And I guess my what I wonder is, how do you get people, especially in these days where the information seems to be so shallow, right? It's all at the headline level, and it's all like with these big words like, oh, a large language model hallucinates and lawyer gets sued for misrepresentation or whatever. It's always these headlines and very little thought into, okay, what's happening here? What do you have any things that you do? Because you seem to be really focused on trying to understand and not just act on these words. Do you have any advice, I guess, or tips for people who aren't experts as to how they can become more informed without going through hours of materials? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think learning by doing is really powerful. And in this kind of context, Like a ChatGPT subscription is $20 a month. Gemini, I think you get 2 months for free at the beginning. Like, just try it. And maybe you need to read one blog. Like, maybe you need to spend an hour kind of getting the general lay of the land. There are enough, YouTube videos, blogs, tutorials at this point. It won't take long to find something that's decent. And then try it on your application. There's both sides, right? Like, don't dismiss it immediately because it made some, clear mistake. But on the other hand, like, don't drink the Kool-Aid. There are many, many applications where large language models are not useful. But like, experiment with it, try it out. And that's, I mean, I've now taught lots of different kind of executive education classes and, professional development, things like that with law school students, with associates, with partners. And across all of them, like, I do demos. I show people how to use the tools, how, when it works and when it doesn't. And the most exciting thing for me is when I can show someone this way led to a dead end, this led to a mistake. Now we tweak things a little bit and look, the outputs are better. So, like, start thinking in those kinds of terms. Yeah, experiment with it. I think that would be my biggest advice. And some of these things are, there are problems, like, for example, the use of copyrighted material, and maybe it matters in your context, or maybe it really doesn't, right? And so you need to be a little bit careful. Like, the whole world is staring at this one technology right now, and so of course, like, there are all sorts of different magnitudes of problems that are arising, and you do need to be like a little bit of a discerning citizen as you kind of consume this information, especially if you like. I can't expect everybody to want to become an expert on these technologies, right? And there's certainly no need. Just like, yeah, experimentation, talk to friends. I think especially if you're kind of thinking about integrating this into your practice, right? Like, your professional life, try to think of like a really repetitive, mundane kind of tasks that you don't enjoy doing that much, and see, maybe you can like build something out. Maybe someone else has built something out already. Maybe you can partner with like a local high school team, college team, whatever, to build something. Like, the beauty here is, I think the barrier to entry is very low. You don't need a computer science degree. You don't need to spend thousands of dollars. It's really quite easy to kind of play around with it. So I don't think there's many reasons not to. Again, don't, start with your most sensitive matter, or like, giving your most sensitive information to some service that you don't know much about. Start with something that, is low risk.
I agree. And can I'm going to share my screen with you and show you what we are doing as far as this implementation goes, because I think it's really interesting how exactly, just as you described, how the shades of how you are working with the technology completely can be very different depending on how you apply it and the demo. But basically, this is our translation editor. And we're trying to create a situation where we're trying to feed large language models, in this case, GPT 3.5 and 4, with context, right? So, for instance, in this case, the blue stuff is machine translation coming from Google. And the yellow stuff is a mixture of terms that have either been self-extracted, like from the translation process by GPT, or that I taught it. And so, for instance, I taught it that I wanted technology in French to be just tech. So when I translate it, instead of using the Google translation, notre technologie, it's using notre tech, which doesn't make sense in French. And it's also picking up that problem as flagging an inconsistency here. The term tech in French translation as an abbreviation of technology. In the English text, the full term is used. To maintain consistency, the full term technology should be used in French. Now, as a human, as a translator, as a professional, I have the right to disagree with this. And if I click here, I'm going to confirm this into my translation memory. I'm going to be warned about the glossary mismatch. And now if I go back to this segment, now this green stuff means, okay, this is what I taught GPT, that's my preference. And so with every sentence, what it's doing is going through everything that is a part of this linguistic context. So in this case, for instance, it's picked up that quality is qualité, and it's picked up that translations can be either traduction or traduction. And based on that, it's trying to suggest what's always the most plausible translation for the translator and trying to learn. So the prompt engineering is all hidden kind of behind. And I guess the question I have for you is, first, before I ask the question, any questions about how the mechanism is working?
No, that makes sense. Kind of at a high level, I think I got a sense.
Cool. Because I guess the question I have is like, for me, for instance, as I'm not very, let's say, keen on the idea that I don't feel threatened by this tech. I still feel that I'm the one translating, I'm the one that's in command, I'm the one ultimately making the decisions. Even if I'm just checking, I still feel that just by verifying and confirming, I play a key role as far as ownership goes. But for a lot of people that were used to translating, let's say, typing and typing from scratch, this is kind of like a little bit overwhelming. It's a different way of working. I guess my question unfolds into two. The first question is, as far as ownership, not copyright, but as far as ownership, do you feel that the sheer act of going over a GPT feed and agreeing with it, does that make you the also a co-owner of that information, or are you just kind of like a passive validator? How do you see this act of validation?
Yeah, I think it's a very context specific kind of question. And we've seen legal bodies decide this in different kinds of ways, right? We have a very similar discussion with the camera, right? Where, it used to be that you needed skill to take a paintbrush and, apply paint to a canvas to paint a really realistic, depiction of a landscape. And now you just press a button. That changes nothing about the ownership of that image. And so I think you can make an analogy to say, look, like there are still artistic decisions, creative expressions encapsulated in that kind of dialogue. I think in many kinds of cases, if you're just translating fairly, general text, right? Maybe a loan agreement from one language into another, I don't really think, maybe there are some contexts where it does, but I think in general, like the ownership piece is not like the legal kind of ownership that I mostly think about. It's more about like, do I feel like comfortable with this work, right? Like, have I done the work? And I think the simple answer to that is like, well, it's your name, right? I mean, it's your work. You're responsible for it. We see the same thing in the legal context, right? Like, I don't really care how my attorney drafted the motion. If she had a team of associates do it, if she sat down, if her process involves, going for a run at 6 a.m. and then writing it, like, I don't care. What I care is that it's correct and that she, as like the expert that I've chosen to hire, that she takes responsibility for it. And if there's something wrong with it, it's her on the line. And the fact that she maybe used like ChatGPT in the background, like it changes nothing about that relationship. I mean, of course, like the duties of professional responsibility are very high when we're talking about lawyer client relationships, but I think for translation it's probably the same thing. Like, it's your work because you're going to take responsibility for it, and I don't think that your client would care how you came about with this. Maybe there are some contexts where there's more nuance to this, but just as a general matter, I think that's how I would portray it. Yeah.
And I agree from the client's perspective. If it meets the goals that it was intended to do, like exactly like, if you win, the motion wins, if it's successful, you don't care if it was generated by a team, by someone by itself after a 6 a.m. run. It doesn't matter, right? But it does matter if the motion is unsuccessful. If something goes wrong, then these things begin to matter. And it's like, oh, I mean, obviously there are certain things that are going to be beyond your visibility, but that's just something that I think that changes when it meets expectations and when it doesn't. But I'm thinking more from the sense of personal integrity kind of thing. So for instance, let's say if you get like, and I do see like the analogy that you're proposing between, let's say, the legal profession and the translation trade, in the sense that if you're drafting out an agreement, for instance, and you're feeling like that's coming out from your head and from your research, the sense of ownership is almost implicit, right? It's going to be hard to disagree that you were the owner. But the minute you begin working with an engine like GPT that's providing to you not just a template, but something maybe even a lot deeper, I think it goes into like this shade of, you mentioned the word responsibility, and responsibility means different things for different people. For me, for instance, I would say I'm part of your camp. If something's being proposed to me, the sheer act of agreeing with it makes me a co-author, even though I mean, I am It's not just a passive agreement. It's something that's involving my critical thought, and I'm not going to just agree with things just because someone's suggesting me them. But I noticed that similarly to kind of like the case that you described, where an attorney used cases that were made up by GPT, and kind of like when if I'm not very familiar, but what I did read about this, I remember that there was the explanation was kind of like, I didn't know that GPT could make up these things, and I trusted it. And well, your job maybe as an attorney is not to trust any information that's in front of you, and so on. So there's an argument of trust and authorship and ownership. And I guess maybe I mean, how deep does that go? Is that a matter that needs to be taken by the educational system from early ages? Is this a matter of system of values? Like, how do we make people understand that, like, again, going back to the translation example, just because I didn't write word for word, from a technical perspective, the minute I check that box, that sentence is now mine. I signed off on it. I'm responsible for it. How, like, again, maybe this comes natural to you, but what would you say for people who don't really understand this blurriness?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, especially because you bring up the educational piece. And I think we all agree that, especially when you're learning, it makes sense to do things yourself, even if you wouldn't be doing them yourself in the same way later on when you're actually practicing. Just because, it's important to be able to do X, spell, do research, write. All these things are important, do long division. But when it comes to, this output and being involved, I mean, I guess I would challenge people to draw the line, right? Because, you didn't create the paper, you didn't build the fax machine or the email server. You aren't, physically writing the characters on the page. So this is one more step, right? And I admit that I know very little about kind of what the real like reality of translation looks like, but in legal services, oftentimes people will have clause libraries. A law firm will do lots of the same agreements over and over. Part of the reason I'm paying so much for them is because I know that they have this experience. Like, I don't want them to write a new contract with a blank Word document. And so it's totally fine if, like, the law firm knows, in our experience, this is the kind of terminology that's used by the industry. This is what we always use, and that's what we'll use for you as well. That's great. Like, that's better, not worse. And I wouldn't be upset as a client if a law firm told me, look, we always use this terminology. Like, it would be crazy for me to say, no, I want a contract that looks nothing like the other contract. I think in a similar way, I mean, now that I think about translation, like, presumably translators know kind of standard ways of formulating things, how something is said in a, formal business context, all these kinds of things. And it's not like cheating if you don't come up with completely new poetry and, like, cadence and vocabulary for every one of your mandates. Like, actually, people want repetition and they want your expertise on what is standard. So when you're checking that box, I think all of this is happening, right? And maybe it's a little bit in a different way. But I mean, to your point about responsibility, like, you shouldn't just mindlessly check the box, because then, yeah, your clients could just go to ChatGPT and translate it there and accept whatever the output is. The whole point of, like, why legal services exist, why we have human experts, is because they have this kind of bit of experience, wisdom, knowledge, cultural context. And, I expect that the interfaces will change. How we interact with documents, how we communicate, how we do, this kind of how we retrieve our information, like our experiences, and bring them out for new mandates. But I think the fundamentals are still quite similar in what you showed me just now. At least how I expect translation works in practice. And if your readers know, I'm sure they do know, or listeners know much more about it. So forgive me if I'm kind of painting with too broad a brush. But I think there are analogies
No,
here.
I agree. I guess what I'm pointing to is that I think in certain trades, the responsibility is super baked into the trade itself. So, for instance, if you're an attorney, there's a great deal of responsibility that you have towards your clients. There are certain codes that you have to abide to. The same thing with the doctor, for instance, right? There's a written and unwritten code of responsibility, and codes that you have to swear by, and you don't you it's a much more regulated form of trade. You have to take the bar exam, you're audited for your work, you're accountable for your decisions. In I think one of the things that I see happening with translations is it tends to be tends to be an undervalued trade, tends to be a commoditized trade. As nuanced as language can be, you don't typically need any kind of formal professional training to call yourself a translator. You need to be able to speak language as well, and you need to be able to do a good job. But there's not that much adhering you to that. And I guess maybe I'm wrong, but I guess what I'm alluding to is if you have, as long as you have the economic incentives well set up. So for instance, let's say in the attorney example, let's say the attorney is making as much using GPT as not, they have no negative incentive to be negligent, let's say. And they're still going to read through it. They're still going to make sure that it's theirs. They still have their integrity and their name to preserve. So all the incentives are kind of aligned so that they're using it as a tool and not as a replacement for their intellectual prowess. Now, but if you come to a trade that's being commoditized, and let's say the incentives are not aligned, and maybe you're not being well paid enough to read through that and to carefully think about that, then all of a sudden it's easy to get into this backseat mindset where it's like, yeah, this was kind of just suggested to me and I went along with it. I wasn't the one writing it to begin with anyway. So I guess my question is, and maybe this isn't something that you've thought about a lot, but it goes more into the economics of this. Like, how much do you think it's important to think about new ways of creating positive economic incentives with this tech in place?
I mean, in a completely general sense, I think incentives matter a great deal in many different kind of capacities, right? I've written a fair amount about incentives around transparency, right? Creating incentives for people who create AI training data to be transparent, and like that regulators should take that seriously. So incentives matter a great deal here, and they will play out in different ways. And like insofar as AI challenges some existing like economic models and relationships between people and institutions, like I'm sure that there are places where we get like misaligned incentives or perverse incentives, like that will happen. In the kind of more narrow case that you sketch, I mean, I think the incentive ought to be that you're not a translator for one day. You're not a lawyer for one day. This is your profession. You're going to do this for a long time. You develop a reputation. You want people to come back to you. So yeah, you can do a shoddy service, quickly translate some documents, not look at what's going on. I think you could have done that pre-ChatGPT. I mean, Google Translate has been around for a while. Similarly, people have done shoddy legal services for a long time. People have performed low quality services. Like, I mean, there's many examples. But, we live in a world where we play repeat games, right? Like, and so it's not rational to kind of cheat your counterpart, because that there are others out there that you're going to interact with the same people. And so I'd like to think that for kind of more narrow cases, the incentives are already there. Like maybe we need to think about them a little bit more, right? But yeah, I mean, we still have an incentive to do a good job. And in fact, my hope is that these tools let us aspire to a higher level of service, right? That, we see this example kind of, I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm interested in access to justice. Public defenders are massively overworked. They're underfunded, overworked, undervalued. And, you can't fault them for not mounting the same level of legal defense as like a highly paid defense attorney. I mean, of course not. If you have hundreds of cases at a time, like you do what you can with the time and the resources you have. My hope is that the AI tools can help, unlock some of this human potential, take away the mundane things, and lift the like quality of service across the board, including in cases where right now there's essentially no access to the services at all, or the quality is just very low. So, I think in many contexts, it makes sense. Like, yeah, automate the basic stuff. And then maybe you can spend more time on thinking, well, actually, when I think about this sentence a little bit more, maybe this terminology like conveys the real thought behind it better, when you wouldn't have had time, when you have to type out every sentence individually. And like, so I think there's potential here to kind of raise the bar for everybody. Yeah, and develop positive reputations, right? As somebody who knows how to leverage the tools that are available, but still kind of takes responsibility, has expertise, all these kinds of.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think one thing that you mentioned that I think is important for translators to keep in mind is that I think the first thing that comes to mind, especially in the threat kind of mindset, is loss. But there's such an overwhelming amount of stuff that either, in the case of translations reason, either doesn't get translated at all or gets really poorly translated. Now that could become a part of the scope. So there could be same thing with the legal cases that either don't get handled at all or get really poorly handled. There's such an abundance of opportunities that could be that are outside most people's radars that could be tackled through the tech. So, I mean, I think there. I guess the key thing that I've noticed from our conversation is that you seem to be very optimistic, kind of like I am. But I think that when you approach this stuff through a more pessimistic kind of lens, it's easy to a, not understand that it's a tool, b, not focus on the upsides, and c, because of that, kind of not potentially even risk missing the train altogether and like not using it at all and becoming relatively uncompetitive in a certain amount of time.
Yeah, I think to put a lot of the things we talked about in the last hour or so together, I think that there are risks. Like I'm not like a techno optimist that feels like we should just charge ahead. I think there are real risks. I talked about some of them. But I think that when it comes to specific domain applications, I have a lot of faith in the experts that exist to be able to assess the risks in their domains, right? And so I think that, I'm optimistic because I think that people can take the technology, think carefully about the kinds of contexts where it makes sense to use it, and then use that technology responsibly and appropriately. Like I'm hopeful that that's the world we will live in. I know that there will be malicious users. I know that there will be inexperienced users. All of that will happen too. But I mean, we've seen many kind of tools that are similar, and only because it's gotten easier to do a certain profession doesn't mean that everybody does it and does it in a poor way. I think expertise continues to matter. So I think the one message is, don't get too intimidated by the vocabulary and the size of the issues and stuff. Like, think about like your specific case and your use case and what could go wrong, how we could design it better. And I think you can do a lot. And then I become optimistic when people think of these.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for your time. For me, it's been a real blast. I've been learning a lot, rethinking a lot of my previous concepts. I'm happy to know that someone as knowledgeable as you has grounded optimism with certain healthy level of skepticism, but is overall excited about these developments. So I'm very grateful for your time, and I know that I already have a lot of more questions, and hopefully we'll get to talk more in the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the kind words and the invitation. This was a lot of fun, and yeah, I hope it's useful to the audience.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. This is Merging Minds. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy this episode. Thank you.
Thanks.